Hello, I'm Barry Forshaw. I'm the author of Crime Fiction: A Reader's Guide, and I'm also the author of the following books: Euro Noir, Nordic Noir, uh, Historical Noir, Brit Noir, and American Noir. But it occurred to me that I needed to have one book which basically did the same job as all of those books, but as a one-stop volume, and also didn't repeat them. So that was the biggest problem, to write a book which did not utilize, it obviously had to utilize the same material, particularly in the case of dead authors, because Agatha Christie isn't writing any new books, but say different things about them, which is what I've tried to do. So that book is this, Crime Fiction: A Reader's Guide. If you saw the earlier one I did when I had my lockdown beard on, I talked about the first chapter. So we are now on to chapter 2, which is the British Golden Age. And it will just be a whistle-stop tour, 5 minutes. And it certainly does not include everything that's in the chapter. It is literally the kind of mountain peaks. When it comes to the British Golden Age, who will be atop that highest Mount Parnassus? It has to be Agatha Christie, of course. And she remains one of the world's best-selling authors. She remains the author that if you're learning English, you use her books as a learning tool, because she has what's almost a virtue as well as a demerit, you like, a fairly limited vocabulary. It's what makes her books work so well, that limited vocabulary, which has been analyzed by computer, is absolutely apposite to exactly what she wants to do in these books. Her books were possibly the best tooled, the best engineered, the best put together books of the British Golden Age. Her detective, as we all know, or her male detective, is Hercule Poirot, who's Belgium. Her female detective is, of course, Jane Marple. And to some degree, she's slightly made a rod for her own back by giving both of them very strong characteristics, which they had to demonstrate in each successive book. They did what anybody who's read E.M. Forster writing about the novel criticizes Dickens. He says that Dickens, whenever he introduces a familiar character like Mr. Micawber, is given a shorthand so you know exactly who you're dealing with at any given time. Christie, the shorthand she'd given for Poirot, the moustache, the egocentricity, the fussy personal appearance. Jane Marple giving the appearance of this kind of elderly spinster, but actually is the sharpest mind in St. Mary Mead. She got slightly tired with the restrictions that she'd given herself, but nevertheless, in the context of what she'd done, she created this amazing corpus of work, which is still read and still influential today. Interestingly enough, I have written a lot about Italian crime literature and Italian crime films, the gialli, interviewing people like Dario Argento, men who specialize in copious operatic bloodletting, are influenced by Agatha Christie. And in fact, the Italian yellow-jacketed series of crime books published by Mondadori, the original gialli, included a lot of Christie. She remains the gold standard. She also remains, if one has to be frank, the image of cozy crime. And that's a disparaging remark. Americans don't seem to mind the description cozy crime, but in Britain it's definitely considered to be a disparaging remark. It doesn't need to be. To a degree, Christie is slightly a victim of the television and films made of her books, which definitely stress the kind of the heritage aspects, the Never Never Land village, which is St. Mary Mead. There was no British village ever which was like that in Britain. But we'd like to think that there was such a place. And when I did a piece for Danish radio, I found a lot of Danes that said that was our first image of British village life is St. Mary Mead. There was also the films. And crucially, certainly in terms of the male casting of Hercule Poirot, there has been this tendency to play him very broadly. And it goes right up to the most recent iterations. In fact, almost everyone, except for one exception, plays Poirot as a kind of music hall figure. And I'm going to alienate a lot of people by what I'm about to say. That includes David Suchet, who is a superb actor and has made, for many, the the definitive Hercule Poirot. Nevertheless, there is an element of parody in the performance. The humor is never far away, and in a way, it's a slight shame that that became the mode. It didn't happen to the same degree with Jane Marple, apart from the very first film iteration, which was Margaret Rutherford, who played Jane Marple as Margaret Rutherford, which is fine. There's a place for that, and everyone loves those movies. But nevertheless, she's been luckier as a character to be played by so many actresses who play her relatively straight. Julia Mackenzie is a good recent example. But there was this tendency by film directors and TV directors to play everyone around Jane Marple like they're in an end of the pier show in Skegness. Everything is very broad, everything is accentuated, and it's a real shame. So it took someone like Sarah Phelps, the dramatist Sarah Phelps, to do her TV versions of Christie and to really toughen her up. They are very controversial, but they show that Christie is flexible enough to take a variety of different treatments. We've only got 5 minutes, so I've got to move on quite quickly to another Golden Age giant, another female writer, Marjorie Ellingham. Here it's easy, unlike with Christie, to come up with one book that if you're going to read one Marjorie Ellingham book, it is Tiger in the Smoke, which is one of the great London novels and is as much a great London novel as anything written by writers who specialized in that. Read today, Tiger in the Smoke seems slightly quaint. It's not quite as cutting edge. It is rather unlikely, everything in it. And the criminal underworld is more in common with Brecht and Weil's Drygroschen Upper, Threepenny Upper than it does with the real criminal world. That doesn't matter. It's still a wonderfully vivid and well-characterized book, with also, of course, one of the great psychopaths of the Golden Age in Havoc. We have also, of course, Josephine Tay, who is another wonderful writer, and whose legacy has been kept alive by a very good English modern writer who doesn't really belong in this chapter because she's still alive, and that's Nicola Upson, who has had the very clever idea of taking Tay and making her a detective. It works in her case. I took exception with people using, for instance, Oscar Wilde as a detective, because how the hell did he have time? Oscar Wilde was either the toast of the London stage or being in disgrace because of the case of the Marquis of Queensberry. He didn't have time to be a detective, so I don't buy that notion. But somehow one can buy Josephine Tay as a detective, and Nicola Upson does them very well. Again, there's one signature book which one needs to mention in the context of Josephine Tay, and that is, of course, The Franchise Affair, which neatly links me into the next great female Golden Age writer. So what does Dorothy Sayers' Gaudy Night have in common with Josephine Tay's The Franchise Affair? I'm going to tell you anyway. Neither of them has a murder. And it's interesting that, as if as a kind of an intellectual exercise, both women set themselves this task of writing a great mystery novel, if you like, in which nobody dies. Sayers, in some ways, is the writer of the Golden Age, the female writer of the Golden Age, for the modern age, which is ironic given that her refined, slightly parodic sleuth, Lord Peter Wimsey, really doesn't wear well in the modern age. We are less taken with aristocratic figures than we might have been in the past. Tay developed him wonderfully as a character, unlike Hercule Poirot, who pretty well stays the same throughout all the books. Lord Peter Wimsey begins in the first book as a slightly aristocratic fop, bit of an idiot. He's closer to the world of P.G. Wodehouse than he is to the detective world. By the time of Gaudy Night, Dorothy Sayers has developed him in the richest possible fashion. He's a wonderful character. And of course, crucially in Gaudy Night, she has now introduced Harriet Vane. And Harriet Vane is one of the most successful female figures in crime fiction. And Gaudy Night, which of course is set in a female college, which is beautifully used in the context of the book, has Harriet Vane, who, in fact, Peter Wimsey in an earlier book has saved from a charge of murder. It's the book in which his proposal of marriage is finally accepted by her. And the reason is another trivia question that people are often amused to ask, is because in a slightly feminist stance, he allows her to go out and put herself in danger. He respects her ability to cope with dangerous situations. It's that, rather than the fact that he proposes in Latin, which is why she says yes. Sayers is still immensely readable today, and Gaudy Night is the one I would suggest that people try. You'll notice an omission here. When I did the first of these, it was pointed out that I was not talking about women writers when I was talking about the antecedents of British crime fiction. The reason for that was the two most important writers for the first chapter were obviously Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Edgar Allan Poe. And I did say in my defense, not mentioning any women, that this section would have a lot of women because the British golden age of crime fiction is essentially female. But there were male writers. You know the actor Daniel Day-Lewis, and a relative of his, Cecil Day-Lewis, C. Day-Lewis, who was the poet laureate, was in fact Nicholas Blake. Those books read extremely well, the Blake mysteries. The one to read possibly is The Beast Must Die, which actually was filmed counterintuitively, very successfully by French director Claude Chabrol, who made Que la Bête Meurt, which was a very faithful treatment in many ways of Nicholas Blake's books. I would also mention another very important English male writer of that era, which is Geoffrey Household, who also didn't create a motif. He took the motif from John Buchan, but in Geoffrey Household, we have the notion of the man on the run. Rogue Male has an aristocratic Englishman again. There were a lot of them around back then, who sets out to kill an unnamed European dictator. We know exactly who it is, and then finds himself on the run in Britain. It has a wonderful sense of landscape and locale, and a nice sense that the hero, rather as in the films of Alfred Hitchcock, like North by Northwest, cannot go to the police. It's established that he is on the run and wanted. This, of course, is John Buchan's The 39 Steps. Those are the leading lights, the crucial elements of the British Golden Age, but there is a great deal more to be discovered. Writers like Martin Edwards, who's a specialist in this era, has been unearthing for the British Library a great many writers, some of whom possibly deserve their neglect, most of whom don't. And the great thing about crime fiction is that it's such a large table, and there is so much for us to feast upon. And I'll get back to you shortly with chapter 3.